The night was cold, sharp like the bitterness Jack had grown used to tasting. He gripped the wheel of his '70 Dodge Challenger, its hum steady, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing within him. His life had always been simple, a man who found solace in less, a minimalist at heart. But tonight, as he drove to Diane's company party, simplicity felt like a cruel joke. How do you simplify betrayal? The hall was radiant with wealth, gold-trimmed chandeliers, laughter echoing against marble floors, and glasses clinking in toasts Jack wasn't privy to. He stood at the edge of the room, feeling smaller than ever. Diane, his wife of 12 years, was dazzling, her laughter effortless, her hand lingering just a moment too long on the arm of her boss, Glenn Robertson. Jack's heart sank further with every glance she didn't return. Little did he know, this night wasn't just a confirmation of his suspicion, it was a catalyst. Toby Wallace, Diane's co-worker, nudged Jack toward the truth with a grin that spoke volumes. Some positions don't require promotions on paper, huh? Jack felt the room spin, its opulence mocking his restraint. And then Marge Simpson, Glenn's wife, leaned in with words cloaked in venom. I hope Diane enjoys her new responsibilities. Glenn's always been hands-on. From the shadows, Jack watched the scene unfold, Diane's laughter, Glenn's magnetic presence drawing her closer. It was all he needed to see. His hand trembled, clutching the car keys as he whispered to himself, this ends tonight. But Jack wasn't a man of fury. His anger, like his life, was deliberate, calculated. As the party dwindled, he moved through the parking lot like a ghost, his plans meticulous. Tires deflated, valves stolen. A silent rebellion against the powerful who had mocked his simplicity. By the time the first engine sputtered, Jack was already miles away. He left a note, short, decisive, like the man he was becoming. I've seen enough. You've taken enough. Goodbye. Chattanooga welcomed him with a quiet that healed and wounded in equal measure. Days blurred into weeks. A supermarket job. A minimalist apartment. And a gym where he pushed his body as hard as his mind. Every pull of a weight, every mile on the treadmill was an exorcism. Then came Helen. Sharp-eyed, with a wit that could disarm even Jack's well-built defenses. She wasn't like the others, her laughter wasn't forced, and her presence felt like the absence of noise. At first, it was just passing smiles at the gym. Then, an audacious invitation, be my +1 to this thing. You'd make the rich snobs nervous. He laughed for the first time in months. Helen wasn't just a lawyer, she was a tactician, a match to Jack's flame. Over time, their connection deepened. He told her about Diane, about the party, the sabotage, and his quiet revolt against the life he'd left behind. Instead of judgment, Helen offered a solution, one that sought not vengeance, but justice. Their partnership wasn't just professional, it became personal. At dinners where they were the loudest voices in the room, to late-night confessions where Helen showed Jack her own scars, they built something neither had expected. And when Jack's daughters finally found him, asking questions he didn't yet have answers for, Helen stood by his side. But life, as always, had its final twist. Diane, emboldened and bitter, revealed a truth that stopped Jack cold. Their divorce had been finalized months ago, her contempt slicing through his hope like a blade. The daughters he thought he'd abandoned? They had come to understand the pain he had endured. They chose to stay for Helen, for the man their father was becoming. In the quiet of their new home, Jack reflected, not on the betrayal, but on the journey it had forced him to take. He'd lost everything he thought mattered. And in losing, he'd found something deeper, a love built not on perfection, but resilience. The scars of betrayal don't fade, they shape. But as Jack sat on the porch of the house Helen had bought, his daughters laughing in the background, he whispered to himself, this is enough. How far would you go to rebuild a life shattered by betrayal? Could you forgive? Or, like Jack, would you find justice not in revenge, but in the arms of something new, something honest? The answers lie not in what we've lost, but in what we're willing to build next. The road stretched before him, endless and indifferent, the night embracing Jack Miller in a cold, suffocating silence. The hum of his '70 Dodge Challenger was a constant companion, steady and unrelenting, like the questions echoing in his mind. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to keep life simple. He believed that simplicity bred clarity, that in stripping away the unnecessary, one could uncover a truth untouched by distraction. And yet, the truth he now faced was anything but simple. The party was supposed to be a celebration, a showcase of Diane's rising career and the culmination of her hard work. Jack should have felt pride. Instead, he felt an unshakable weight, one that had been pressing on his chest for months. It began as a whisper, an almost imperceptible shift in her gaze, a newfound urgency in her late-night calls and unexplained absences. Suspicion had crept in like a thief, and no amount of self-reassurance could quiet the unease that now roared within him. As he navigated the dimly lit streets, Jack reflected on the woman Diane once was. He saw her face as it had been years ago, alive with warmth, her laughter ringing with an honesty that had been his refuge. Their life had been modest, but it was theirs, a shared understanding, a mutual respect for what they had chosen to build together. Or so he thought. The hall was a symphony of opulence when he arrived. Gilded chandeliers dangled like trophies, illuminating a crowd that radiated affluence and ambition. The laughter that filled the air was effortless, almost rehearsed, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. This wasn't his world, nor was it one he wanted to inhabit. But Diane, poised and radiant, seemed perfectly at home. He scanned the crowd, his eyes following her every movement. She glided through the room with a confidence that stung, a confidence that felt foreign, alien to the woman he thought he knew. And then came the first blow. Toby Wallace, her colleague, sidling up to him with an easy grin that carried an edge of malice. Some positions don't require promotions on paper, huh? Toby's words were a dagger, delivered with casual cruelty. Jack froze, his mind racing to decipher the cryptic insinuation. And then there was Marge Simpson, her presence sharp and deliberate. Her words were not veiled, they were a declaration. I hope Diane enjoys her new responsibilities. Glenn's always been hands-on. The sting of betrayal cut through Jack like a blade. Glenn Robertson, the company president, a man who exuded power and charm in equal measure, Jack didn't need confirmation. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Jack retreated to the shadows, a silent observer to the spectacle unfolding before him. Diane's laughter, Glenn's magnetic pull, the way the crowd celebrated her with a reverence he had never seen before. It was a play, and she was the star. But what stung most was the realization that she had chosen this stage over the life they had built together. Rage bubbled beneath the surface, but Jack was not a man prone to outbursts. His anger was cold, precise, a tool to be wielded rather than an emotion to be indulged. As the party began to wind down, Jack moved with calculated intent. Each action was deliberate, each movement a silent act of defiance. The parking lot became his battlefield, the vehicles of Diane's colleagues his targets. He worked swiftly, methodically, dismantling their symbols of status and power. When he finally walked away, he felt no remorse, only a grim satisfaction. The note he left behind was brief, a punctuation mark on a chapter he had no intention of revisiting. I've seen enough. You've taken enough. Goodbye. It was not a plea for understanding or forgiveness. It was a declaration of finality. The road stretched before him once again, but this time it held the promise of freedom. He drove without destination, his thoughts as unbound as the miles passing beneath him. The weight of betrayal lingered, but it was joined by something else, a spark of determination, a refusal to be defined by the actions of others. Chattanooga greeted him with the quiet he so desperately craved. It was a city that asked nothing of him, that offered him the anonymity to rebuild himself from the ground up. His new apartment was sparse, almost ascetic, a reflection of the man he wanted to become. The job at the supermarket was unremarkable, but it grounded him, gave him a rhythm to anchor his days. Jack's routine became his salvation. The gym was a place of solace, the weights a tangible representation of the burdens he carried and the strength he was cultivating to bear them. He kept to himself, his interactions with others limited to polite nods and brief exchanges. He wanted no ties, no complications, but even in isolation, he could not completely escape his past. His daughter's voices on the phone were a reminder of the life he had left behind. Laura and Linda, their concern evident in every word, tried to reach him, to understand the reasons for his sudden departure. Jack's responses were clipped, evasive. How could he explain the depth of his pain, the sense of betrayal that had shattered the foundation of their family? And yet, despite his efforts to distance himself, a part of him longed for connection. The love he had for his daughters was a tether he could not sever, no matter how far he ran. But for now, he chose solitude, hoping that in the quiet, he might find a way to piece himself back together. Jack Miller was a man stripped bare, his life reduced to its most essential elements. But in that reduction, he found a clarity he had never known. He was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he was determined to become. And as the days turned into weeks, a question began to take shape in his mind. What does justice look like for a man who has nothing left to lose? Chattanooga became a sanctuary, but even sanctuaries have their cracks. Jack Miller settled into the rhythm of his new life, a life stripped of excess, obligations, and the weight of betrayal. Days were predictable, his routines a carefully constructed armor to shield him from the chaos of emotion he refused to confront. Yet, within the structured monotony, something unexpected began to emerge, a faint yearning for connection, for a spark that his self-imposed isolation couldn't extinguish. And then, there was Helen. She entered his world not like a storm, but like a quiet breeze, a presence unassuming yet impossible to ignore. Jack first noticed her at the gym, her movements purposeful, her focus unyielding. Helen was a woman who carried herself with a sense of conviction, a quiet authority that demanded respect. Jack, ever the observer, found himself intrigued despite his resolve to remain detached. Their interactions began as little more than passing glances, polite nods exchanged in the shared silence of their workouts. But there was something about her, a flicker of recognition, as though she too understood what it meant to rebuild from the ashes. It was Helen who bridged the gap, her words simple yet disarming, an invitation, unexpected and bold. She needed an escort to a corporate dinner, and for reasons Jack couldn't fully explain, he accepted. The preparation for that night was a journey in itself, one that forced Jack to confront the remnants of the man he used to be. He stood before a mirror, staring at a reflection that no longer felt like his own. The sharp lines of his freshly trimmed beard, the unfamiliar weight of new clothes, the sleek haircut, it was as though he were donning a costume, stepping into a role he hadn't rehearsed. Yet beneath the veneer, there was a spark of something he hadn't felt in months: his curiosity, maybe even hope. The dinner was a battlefield of subtlety, a clash of wit and pretense. Jack, initially hesitant, found his footing alongside Helen. She navigated the room with ease, her sharp tongue cutting through the snobbery of those around them. Jack followed her lead, his own sense of humor resurfacing in unexpected moments. The laughter they shared that night was different, authentic, unburdened by the weight of expectation. Afterward, the evening took a turn neither had planned. They abandoned the gilded facade of the event, trading fine wine for fast food, and spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Helen shared stories of her career as a lawyer, the battles she fought in courtrooms and the toll it had taken on her. Jack listened, offering pieces of his own story in return, carefully at first, then with a growing sense of trust. As their connection deepened, Jack found himself drawn to Helen in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was unlike anyone he had known, resilient, unapologetically honest, and fiercely intelligent. Yet beneath her confidence lay a vulnerability that mirrored his own. It was in the quiet moments between them that Jack began to see the possibility of something more, a life not defined by loss but by the potential for renewal. And then came the night he told her about the party. The words spilled out in fragments, each one heavy with the weight of memory. Jack spoke of the opulence, the betrayal, the calculated revenge that had unfolded in the parking lot. He expected judgment, perhaps even disgust, but Helen surprised him yet again. She listened with an intensity that bordered on fascination, her eyes never leaving his as he recounted the details of his silent rebellion. What began as a confession became a collaboration. Helen, ever the strategist, saw the seeds of something greater in Jack's story. She asked for the stolen documents, not out of curiosity, but with a purpose Jack didn't yet understand. There was a spark in her gaze as she pieced together a plan, one that would turn Jack's act of defiance into a pursuit of justice. As the weeks unfolded, their bond grew stronger. Helen pushed Jack to confront the pain he had buried, while Jack, in turn, became a steady presence in her life, a partner in both purpose and companionship. Together, they navigated the complexities of their growing relationship, their shared experiences forging a connection that neither had expected. But life, as always, had a way of complicating things. News reached Jack that Diane had been fired from her position, a revelation that left him torn between satisfaction and lingering resentment. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Helen's involvement had set events into motion. Helen, ever the professional, revealed that 3 of Diane's colleagues had accepted financial settlements to avoid lawsuits tied to the fallout of that night. It was a victory, albeit a small one, and Jack found himself grappling with the implications. Justice, it seemed, was not as black and white as he had once believed. Their celebration was subdued, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had achieved together. Over dinner at a sophisticated restaurant, Helen opened up in ways she never had before. She spoke of her own scars, the battles she had fought and the doubts that lingered despite her successes. Jack listened, his own walls slowly crumbling as he realized that in Helen, he had found not just an ally, but a partner who understood the complexities of his journey. The chapter was far from over, but for the first time in months, Jack felt a sense of clarity. He had found something worth holding on to, a connection that gave him the strength to face whatever lay ahead. In Helen, he saw not just a reflection of his pain, but the possibility of healing, of rebuilding a life that was not defined by what he had lost, but by what he was willing to fight for. And so, as the nights grew longer and their bond deeper, Jack Miller began to see the outlines of a new future, one built not on revenge, but on the quiet resilience of 2 souls who had found each other in the aftermath of betrayal. Jack Miller had spent months learning to live with himself, stripping away the layers of anger, betrayal, and regret until all that remained was a man trying to make sense of his broken pieces. But no matter how far he ran or how meticulously he rebuilt his life, there were still things left undone, conversations left unsaid, and questions that refused to fade. It was Helen who finally gave him the courage to face it all. to confront the remnants of a life he thought he had abandoned for good. The lunch meeting was her idea, a chance for Jack to see his daughters and, at last, to face Diane on equal footing. But as he sat across from her in the restaurant, he realized there was no equal footing to be found. Diane sat poised, her expression sharp and defiant, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Jack, who had imagined this moment for so long, felt the words stick in his throat. He had prepared for confrontation, for anger, for the opportunity to finally lay bare all that had been buried. What he hadn't prepared for was Diane's revelation. She had divorced him months ago. The words landed like a punch, stealing the air from Jack's lungs. For all his efforts to take control of the narrative, Diane had been one step ahead, severing ties while he was still piecing together what remained. Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she dismissed his attempts at explanation, her gaze flicking toward Helen with thinly veiled contempt. Whatever shred of understanding Jack had hoped for evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only the hollow ache of finality. But amid the wreckage, there was an unexpected shift. Laura and Linda, Jack's daughters, stayed behind after Diane left. Their curiosity about Helen was genuine, their questions tentative but hopeful. For the first time in months, Jack felt the fragile threads of connection beginning to mend. Helen, ever the diplomat, handled their curiosity with grace, her warmth and honesty weaving a bridge that Jack hadn't been able to build himself. As the hours passed, Jack found himself sharing moments he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. He spoke of his journey, of the choices he had made and the reasons behind them. He saw the pain in his daughter's eyes, but he also saw understanding, the faint glimmer of reconciliation. For the first time, he felt that perhaps he hadn't lost everything after all. In the days that followed, Jack and Helen began planning their next steps. The decision to leave Chattanooga was not an easy one, but it felt inevitable. They needed a fresh start, a place where the shadows of the past couldn't reach them. Helen, ever the pragmatist, had already found a house in another state, a home that would be theirs to build together. The move was a whirlwind, but it brought with it a sense of renewal. The house was modest but warm, a reflection of the life they were creating. Jack threw himself into the work of making it a home, finding solace in the physical labor and the quiet moments shared with Helen. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, not the fleeting kind, but something deeper, more enduring. Months passed, and the distance from his old life brought clarity. Jack reached out to Laura and Linda, tentative at first, but with a growing sense of confidence. Their visits became more frequent, their conversations less strained. He saw in them the resilience he had always admired, and he began to believe that, in time, they might fully forgive him. As for Diane, she had moved to another state, her life taking a path that no longer intersected with Jack's. He thought of her less and less, the sharp edges of his memories softening with time. There was no satisfaction in her absence, only a quiet acceptance that some chapters are meant to close. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack found himself on the porch of his new home. Helen sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, his daughters, playing a game in the yard. It was a sound Jack hadn't realized how much he missed, a reminder of all he still had to be grateful for. He thought back to the man he had been a year ago, consumed by anger and betrayal, his life reduced to a series of calculated acts of defiance. That man felt like a stranger now, a shadow that had been left behind on the long road to this moment. Jack had found justice, yes, but more importantly, he had found himself. And yet, as he sat there, a question lingered in his mind, a question that had followed him from the beginning. How far must we go to rebuild a life torn apart? For Jack, the answer lay not in revenge, but in the quiet, steady work of starting over. It lay in the courage to face the pain, to make amends, and to allow love to take root once more. He looked over at Helen, her face lit by the soft glow of the setting sun. She had been his anchor, his partner in the storm, and now, she was his future. Together, they had weathered the worst and come out stronger for it. And as the laughter of his daughters filled the air, Jack knew that this was enough. For all the questions that remained, one thing was certain: Jack Miller was no longer running. He was home.